Chapter 8. Hannah held her breath. She heard Papa clear his throat. My wife's name was May, he began. She passed away about 3 years ago when Hannah was 11. Hannah sensed surprise in the hush that followed. Then she heard a few murmurs of what might have been sympathy. May was a Christian, raised by missionaries, Papa went on. After she died, my daughter had her lessons from a good churchwoman. Now she's got it in her head that she wants to graduate. I figure she needs maybe 2 more terms of school. Then she'll be helping me at the new shop. We aim to settle down here and run a good business. Pause. If there's going to be any trouble, it won't be either of us starting it. Silence. I'm not saying to chase them out of town, Baxter's voice again, but there's got to be laws about this. I know coloreds can't go to school with our kids. Indians can't either. Isn't it the same for Chinamen? There's a question. What's the law, Harris? Someone else called out. Yet another clamor began, followed by the rapping sound. This time Mr. Harris spoke slowly. I have to admit, I don't know where the law stands on this, he said. I tell you what, there's no state house as yet. We're governed from Washington. I'll write a few letters of inquiry, and I'll call another meeting once I hear back. Apparently, Mr. Baxter was still not satisfied. And she'll be kept out of school until then? No, she'll attend school as long as there are no problems. And it'll be up to Miss Walters to decide otherwise, same as with any other student. Oh, that might be breaking the law. Now a voice that Hannah hadn't heard before. We don't know that. It might just as well be breaking the law to keep her out of school. As a school board member, I've got to go by what I know. Last place I was on the school board was Ohio, and there every child under the age of 16 has to be in school. Same in New York State, someone else agreed. But they probably don't have Chinamen living there, Mr. Baxter again. If they did, you'd know there'd be a law against it. Baxter, Mr. Harris's voice was firm. We've made our decision. You don't like it? You can write your own letters. I might just do that. Mr. Baxter sounded belligerent but said nothing more. Hannah realized that the meeting was likely to end soon. She ducked down low again and began creeping away from the depot. Hannah, Sam called to her in a loud whisper. She stopped and looked back, worried that if she didn't, he'd raise his voice loud enough for someone to notice. I'll see you in school, he said. She could hear the smile in his voice. As she hurried home, she tried to recall every word of the meeting, but she soon found herself thinking about Sam instead. She couldn't help smiling, and her cheeks flushed again. The thrill was only momentary. Although she and Papa had never spoken of it, she'd gradually come to realize what leaving California had meant for her future. In the Chinatowns of Los Angeles and San Francisco, there were so many men and so few women that she might have been able to marry a Chinese man, despite being half white. But the farther east they traveled, the fewer Asians they had seen, and here in the eastern half of Dakota Territory, there didn't seem to be any at all. Besides which, every territory that had become a state in recent years had made it illegal for whites and non-whites to marry. So Hannah was quietly making plans for a future that would see her dependent on no one except herself. Graduation, then a shop as a seamstress, first with Papa and someday on her own. She shook her head as if to shed the image of Sam's friendly face. No room in those plans for daydreaming about a white boy, no matter how kind. Once home, she hurried up the stairs and got ready for bed. Papa had installed a board wall in the attic of the rented house, dividing it into 2 rooms. Her half was at the back of the house. She was sliding under the quilt when she heard him come in. Moments later, his tread sounded on the stairs. He climbed halfway and stopped. Hannah? He said, his voice low. She clutched the edge of the quilt. She couldn't see his face, couldn't tell what his tone of voice meant. Yes, Papa? I'm not asleep yet. How ridiculous. She was answering him. Of course she wasn't asleep. We'll talk in the morning, he said. But if you're going to disobey me, you'll have to learn to cover your tracks better. You left the door unlatched. That was all. Before she could reply, he went back down the stairs. Hannah drew in a deep breath. She smiled as she turned on her side and curled up a little. Papa Papa could still surprise her sometimes. The next morning, Hannah knew what Papa would say before he said it. "I don't know, Hannah. People are already riled. I don't like the smell of it." She paused before she spoke. "Mr. Harris said I could attend school until he hears back from Washington on what the law is." No answer. Yesterday afternoon had given her a tantalizing glimpse of school at its best. If she could have lessons like that for the rest of the term, she could graduate as Mama had wanted. There was another reason, though, a more important one. The world was so often unfair, and she couldn't do a single thing about most of that unfairness. But she had learned from Mama to fight it where she could, and that meant right here in LaForge. It wasn't fair that people thought she should be kept out of school because she was half Chinese. If she stopped going, folks like Mr. Baxter would think she'd given in. Her face must have shown what she couldn't say, for Papa sighed in irritation, then nodded. "All right," he said. "Might as well finish out the week now that we've put Harris to all that trouble." At school that morning, more than half a dozen seats were empty. Hannah did not know exactly who was missing, but she knew that her presence was the reason for their absence. Dolly took advantage of the absences by moving to a different seat. She did so with just enough fuss and flounce to confirm what Hannah already knew. Dolly felt that having to share a desk with Hannah was beneath her. Miss Walters made no mention of the absent students, and the morning lessons proceeded smoothly. After arithmetic and history, Hannah used pen and ink to write a verse from a poem for the penmanship lesson. She chose Mama's poem, which she knew by heart. "To My Mother" by E.K. Hervey. "I know thou art gone to the land of thy rest. Then why should my soul be so sad? I know thou art gone where the weary are blessed, and the mourner looks up and is glad." Hannah loved practicing penmanship. She cherished a memory from when she was a small girl in Los Angeles of being given a brush and a little pot of ink to experiment with while Mama and a group of friends practiced Chinese brush writing. In their hands, the brushes had seemed almost alive, their movements fluid and airy and solid all at the same time. Their lettering was a song of ink that flowed from the bristles. Hannah could not yet read, but she copied some of the shapes that the adults were making. One of Mama's friends praised her efforts. "Already she has a good eye," Mama replied with obligatory modesty. "She's so young. Who knows if it will grow with her?" But she gave Hannah a little sideways smile that made her so proud. Mama had gotten sick before she could teach Hannah much more about calligraphy. Writing with a pen was nothing like lettering with a brush. The pen seemed labored and scratchy by comparison. Still, perfecting her handwriting was another way that Hannah sought to keep Mama close and clear, to stop her from slipping into a hazy memory. Hannah thought penmanship was a bit like sewing, where her hands and her mind had to be connected to each other. It was different from, say, reading, which took mostly her mind, or chores like laundry, which her hands could do almost without thought. For penmanship, she first had to think about the correct way to write a word, and then get her hand to do what her brain was thinking. She especially liked the letters called descenders, and always tried to make sure that their tails were in exact alignment. When she'd done a good job with a page of writing, she would hold the paper at arm's length so she could see the pen strokes without reading the contents. The slanted lines of the descenders lent a sort of visual rhythm to the page, giving it a form and feeling beyond the meaning of the words. Hannah finished copying the poem and set the page carefully on the corner of her desk to dry. While not a perfect effort, it more than satisfied her. She wondered why she'd never thought to write out that poem before. During the noon hour, she left the room to use the privy. She lingered outside for a while, watching the older boys play a three-cornered game of catch. By the time she went back inside, several other students were already in the schoolroom. Her penmanship paper was no longer on the corner of her desk.